we have a string of evidence, two particular people, a husband and wife team called the Verrills, whose work should be properly acknowledged, who found evidence of the Sumerians in America and Sumerian writing. And when we start to scratch the surface here, we're looking at some very, very exciting realizations that the Sumerian culture had ocean-going ships at 5000 BC and had traveled the world and had colonized large parts of the world. And those traditions had come from that region between the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. And Menes, being the king of Egypt, literally was given the job as the first king by Sargon I. And that is something else that needs verification. It needs more work doing on it. It's going to be considered speculative until we do more work and do more research and get this big picture in place. Indeed. And this is where it's so important to be open-minded.
Indeed, definitely. So Sumerians that potentially had a world empire, if you will, and this might have been going in different waves, so to speak, as well, because there are indications that point to the fact that there might be runes in America as well. We have this rune stone found in America. Off the top of my head, I forget the names of it, but they were found. And of course, there are a number of things like this. But do you think that the global the global society or empire that the Sumerians had, that this as well was disrupted, and eventually these different groups broke off into the segments that we've been kind of picking up on and following today? Like we're seeing the South Americans as separate; they are a different branch. We see the Egyptians as one, the Sumerians as one, etc. Do you think that small catastrophes following this, like the one in 2000, 354 that you mentioned, might have contributed into breaking up this as well?
Yes, I think it certainly broke up what was happening across from the Mediterranean to India. And of course, there was the moving south of the monsoon rains, which were fertilized, if you like, and provided water for the Sumerian plains. And when those monsoons moved south and there was desiccation set in, then you had big migrations from Sumeria from about 2700, 2800 BC. And this is where you have the story of people going into Persia, going down in the Indus Valley, where they were already their relatives were farming, into Tibet and into China. And the Chinese civilization, which had already been established by Fuxi, who was a shining one, at 7,500, 8,000 BC, they were supplemented much later, 2,700, by what Terry and Lacouperie calls the Black Sing tribes from Sumeria, Nungti, who was Hungti, and Shen Nung, the farmer, who was in fact Sargon. Sargon was a key figure here at this time. Mm-hmm. And we think that my belief is that there were maybe 3 or 4 Sargons, but we have some extraordinary research which was done by Terry and Lacouperie on the Western origins of Chinese civilization, and a book that was which was published in I think 1896. And Terry and Lacouperie was the man who linked the Chinese writing with the Sumerian writing. Early Sumerian pictorial arrives in China.
Wow.
And so there are direct links between China and the Sumerians, and China has preserved so much of these Sumerian traditions.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I think that this is fascinating. Now I would just want to ask you this thing about the races, the different races. And do you think that this might be a subsequent, and this is something that has happened after the fact that this has been the world's global network has been broken up into these different factions? Or do you think that if in fact humanity was developed in this way, that the Anunnaki were creating different races at that point? What do you think about that?
No, I don't think they were. I see the Anunnaki as benevolent, and so does Plato, so does Charles Rollin, and so do many other people.
Sure.
If we're looking at the great anthropologists like W.J. Perry in the 1920s, 25, 26, 27, his 3 books, The Origin of Magic and Religion was one of them, The Growth of Civilization, and the children of the sun. He was spot on. He realized, as did somebody called Elliot Smith at that time, that the progress of population of the world had come from the Near East region. And what he says, which is very important to your point, is that over distance and time, you begin to get people forgetting what the old story was all about and the old disciplines were all about. And the reasons for these movements and colonizations, if you like, was just simply population. One of the rules they always had was that a city-state gets to a certain size, and so that it doesn't overpopulate, and overpopulation was a massive problem. But when it looks like it's getting too many people, a young man who's done his 20 years training is given the rolled measuring tape and the standard unit of measure, the measuring rod, and takes 200 craftsmen and their families and starts a city-state somewhere else. Now, this is wonderful because it's like dividing the egg, and using the same rules, the same standard unit of measurement. And if the land in the country in which he lives is already too occupied, too many people, then they will get on ships and go and form colonies elsewhere. And that's how we see city-states, the city-state system, all over the world from the very earliest times. And I'm saying we're talking about a very successful city-state system, a royal society which worked wonderfully and peacefully from the time of Jericho at 9000 BC right the way through to 2500 BC, and certainly to 3500 BC, which was a sort of date when the city of Uruk was at about 50,000 people, and was a peak of the Sumerian civilization, a successful and happy and peaceful civilization.
Fascinating. So this is potentially how things were, and what you're talking about here, of course, is that there was a structure here, there was law and order, and there was potentially even, as you say, there was more stability in those societies back then than what we can see today. It feels like we always kind of approach this, idea of when we're looking back that there might be a different system back then, meaning that they were able to live in a better way than we do today. Today it feels like the opposite thing almost. It feels like the people who are least fit to lead, so to speak, are put in places or positions of government and politics and so forth. So it's very weird, but it's interesting yet to look back and think that we might actually have had a system back then that was much more efficient and actually working, if you will.
There are two key points here which I hope will emphasize this harmony throughout the world, which is the Indo-European writing, which I've talked about in terms of the alphabet. And we find the runes, as you quite rightly say, from Spain, Britain, right to the Americas. And the runes were a codified alphabet, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
In other words, the alphabet, which was the in-house writing and language of the elite, was codified into in a form which was used within the runes. That's why we find the runes being used by the Basque right from the very earliest times, which give us little clues to where these people came from, and that they always had this in-house system and alphabetic text, and also numerals as well. Mathematics was something they really understood. But in the question of law and order, I just want to talk to you about who provided these ancient laws. Now, we hear about Hammurabi and we hear about Ashuna, both Sumerians, Ashuna something like 2200 BC, and Hammurabi about 1800 BC. And the famous black stele, which is in the Louvre Museum, which is their ancient laws, which Hammurabi tried to re-establish. And right at the top, Thorkild Jacobson, in his book The Treasures of Darkness, makes it quite clear that the translation right at the top of that stele is that these are the edicts of Anu and Enlil. In other words, we're back to An and Enlil from this original group.
Yeah.
So the laws which they established had survived from 9,500 BC to 1800 BC. And even when this much later King Marduk comes on the scene. Mm-hmm. He is ruling in the name of An, or Anu. Anu was the later Akkadian translation, whereas An was the original Sumerian translation. There are small changes as we go along.
Yes.
And those wonderful laws gave equality, total equality to women, which is very important. It also, importantly, gave anybody who made false accusations or bore false witness, that was considered to be as serious a crime as theft or murder. Very important in this modern age where people make their living by presenting misleading or untruthful information.
Exactly. So this is fascinating. This is an idea here that structure, law and order is very ancient. It might have spawned from the Anunnaki, as you say here. This has developed in some way. And of course, you know, speaking of if we go back a little more and talk about some of the farming and agriculture ideas behind this, you presented some very interesting information when it comes to animals and domesticated animals. For instance, the comparison between the pig and the wild boar, and there's a whole interesting story behind that as well. Tell us about that.
Well, that's right. I've used some of Lloyd Pye's material because I believe that much of Lloyd Pye's work is very valuable. And, of course, his book was Everything You Know Is Wrong, which is a good starting point. But he makes some very good points in comparing the jaw or the teeth of the domesticated pig with the wild pig.
Yes.
And the behavior patterns of the wild cattle, how long it took to domesticate them. There are a number of features there on lloydpye.com, I think it is, website, which are well worth looking at. What we have to realize is that certain species, like we find the pig, the cow, and Mesopotamian fallow deer, for example, all being domesticated and arriving in Cyprus at something like 7,500 BC. Mm-hmm. So they were domesticating wild animals or are farming animals. And there may not have been any genetic manipulation in terms of fallow deer or antelope, because the animal kingdom is quite extraordinary in terms of how a good man can tame an animal. We seen this history in circuses and etc. But it is a subject which, if you're interested, it's worth looking at. And we find this. We find all these domesticated animals and the domesticated crops all around about the same time at the same place. Now, you've only got to think about the statistical odds of that happening. You've got to accept, I believe, that the fact that they're all there around the same time, around the same place in this Near East region is an indication that something special is happening, and that must only come from very special, knowledgeable people.
Yes, indeed. And this is, the region here, we've I guess we've talked about it all the time, but yet not kind of mentioned it. And so I do want to kind of emphasize and mention that right now, car sag. This is, we talked about the water course and things like this in the first segment, but this is basically potentially then actually the place of the Garden of Eden. Is that correct?
Yes. The word karsag, if you look at the very early picture language, then the picture language would show you something that looks like a field or an enclosure, and the man's head. And the sag was the sound that went with the man's head, and the kar or gar went with what looks like the enclosure. It's where we can see it, the origin of our word garden. And there are various lines coming into the way this evolved within the cuneiform to show that the gardens were irrigated. You could tell an irrigated garden from an unirrigated garden. And irrigation, of course, was very, very early and of course, crucial at the time that these people settled in southern Lebanon. This is information I had from another leading archaeologist